those who've been reading along with my actual play of Dragonlance Shadows of the Dragon Queen, or been watching my reviews for each chapter / actual play notes and that sort of thing for each chapter of the game, and who are just familiar with the adventure itself, may have noticed that I'm past the halfway point of the adventure on the actual play write-ups, and probably by the time this video goes up, I'll have posted the blog post for the last chapter for the our last session of the current chapter, which means that I, as the game master, need to start thinking about what comes next. This has in turn had me looking over some of the game books that are in my collection and coming to some serious thoughts about what a tabletop RPG needs to help with onboarding, and based on what I think would help my players consider some of the more niche games in my collection. This is brought on by wanting to run something different, in some degree or another, from D&D. Dungeons & Dragons is the $600 million juggernaut of the role-playing game industry, and it's nice to branch out into other games from smaller publishers. Not that I don't like D&D, I mean, I'm running it. I chose to run it. I picked this adventure and everything, and I've bought a copy of every edition of D&D that's come out, more or less, along with most of the rulebooks and adventures for 5th edition. But I've got other non-D&D games I'd like to run, though some are certainly D&D derived, either mechanically or in terms of the idioms that it's playing through, being dungeon fantasy games. But it's all got me thinking about what are some of the things that would help other RPGs that aren't Dungeons & Dragons find adoption. And I'm particularly in terms of what games have succeeded and managed to thrive to a certain degree over time, and the things that they have done that have made that work. Number 1, a gameplay cycle. This is related to, but different from, what would be called in a video game an example of the, quote, gameplay loop. That is basically laying out to the players and the game master what the hell you're doing over the course of a campaign, or at least an adventure, and specifically what the cycle of that adventure would be. For example, in Shadowrun, you go to meet with your Mr. Johnson. He gives you the job. In the course of that meet, the players ask questions to learn more about what he actually is, and ultimately who he works for and who they're running against, in addition to negotiating for money, and other equipment and that sort of thing is needed. And if they're going to get screwed, they also need to know what's the likelihood of that's going to be, and also if they're actually being hired to do something kind of shitty. And you can go from here to a larger campaign cycle. How do player characters advance? What are the goals that some player characters might have over the course of a campaign? What resources do the characters accumulate, and what do they do with them when they have them? What does the end game of the campaign look like outside of, life gets in the way and the campaign ends in a whimper? All of these things are things that the players and the GM know what they're getting into and can be provided by this example. This is also something that you can use for sourcebook ideas and supplements as well. For example, the Shadowrun Companion sourcebook gets into the idea of alternative campaign frameworks, like working for Dockwagon. And this is perfect material for those books as well. This can also include a example of play sort of actual play transcript to help flesh out the moment-to-moment gameplay of the game to players, but you shouldn't stop there. Because this isn't just about moment-to-moment, this is the framework of the adventure itself. Now, if your advice for GM prep, and I've encountered this in the wild, is roll on the slew of random tables at the back of the book to put together your adventure, then you still need to have that gameplay cycle example, because if your game is basically rolling on table, or your prep is roll on tables to fill out the Mad Libs form, you have to have the Mad Libs form. And thus, in turn, the concept of what players are going to do with it. And if you are the kind of RPG author who advocates that rolling on random tables should entirely replace GM prep, not even having the Mad Libs form, look, buddy, you had to do a lot of learning before you got to that point in the first place. Just by the nature of the thing, nobody is born a good, or even perfect. Nobody's born a perfect game master. Nobody's even born a good game master. And speaking of which, 1A, really good GM and player advice chapters. Way to number 1, The more your game differs from Dungeons & Dragons, in terms of the assumptions of how a session should play out, what characters do, and how they approach challenges, the more important it is to have material in the book that delves into approaching the assumptions that the players would come to this game from other RPGs, and, for that matter, Dungeons & Dragons in particular, would need to know. How to explain to them how things are different in this game, and how this relates to the duties of the GM and the player. Even for its different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, if you are doing a gritty OSR game where death is around every corner, even at high levels, then by comparison to 5th edition, you need to provide information to players that, hey, this is a dark, gritty, harsh game where death is around every corner, and also maybe that player characters are meant to be somewhat expendable, and it's normal to say, hey, I'm just taking this stat and adding the second to the end of the character name just so I get back in the game quickly. Number 2, a sample adventure. This may seem particularly trad as an RPG concept, but for game masters coming from more traditional role-playing games, especially, well, Dungeons & Dragons, it provides an additional purpose. It lets the game master know what kind of prep they need to do, and just as importantly, what kind they don't need to do. You don't explore a dungeon in Dungeon World the way you would explore one in 13th Age, which is different than how you'd explore one in Shadowdark. Investigation Call of Cthulhu works differently mechanically than one in Trails of Cthulhu. Exploring the Wasteland in Gamma World is going to be different from the way it works mechanically in Apocalypse World. This all helps with the GM with the answer to the question of, how do I prepare? Also, if your GM is taking an adventure from a different RPG in the same genre and trying to convert it to your game, it would work better if you rethink a lot of the idioms related to that adventure instead of just dropping it straight in with minimal changes. This makes for a good way to get the GM in the right mindset. An example of this is for a good adventure that serves as a start is the adventure of the Jacket from the Cyberpunk Edgerunners box set, because of how it provides a beat map for the adventure, showing the various ways that the game's plot can play out. Now, Seth Skorkowski has a really good review of the adventure that I'd recommend GMs watch, even if you're not running at Cyberpunk Red, but I'll link to that in doobly-doo and let you see for yourself. Older Shadowrun adventures like Dream Chipper and Mercurial are also very good at this, in terms of how they structure the information and how it's presented to the game master. Number 3, a sample campaign or adventure path. This is taking number 2 and the second part of number 1 and combining them together. It is saying, here is a place to start your campaign, and here's a place to finish, and here's a bunch of things to do on the way there. It helps tell GMs a way you can structure things on a larger scale, beyond a bunch of vignettes and standalone stories, and, depending on your game, can provide advice to game masters on how to incorporate the narrative hooks that your players set up into the larger campaign. Having a sample adventure is absolutely helpful. Having a campaign to follow up on helps even more. This doesn't have to be anything as heavily scripted as Shadows of the Dragon Queen. It can be a plot point campaign, like is what's been published alongside campaign settings for Savage Worlds. It can be a campaign setting with a plot timeline attached to it, showing what the agendas of the various factions in the smaller setting are and how things can play out if the players don't get involved, and what ways those factions can react to, or will react when the players throw a spanner in the works. The key is showing the GM, here is how the ways that a larger story can play out, so that they have an idea of how to structure that larger narrative when they're crafting their own stories, and building off of what their player characters are doing over the course of a game. Number 4, an NPC/antagonist/challenge book. Finally, your player characters are going to run into non-player characters, and they're going to end up confronting some of those NPCs. Maybe they're fighting them. Maybe they're getting into debates with them, or cooking duels, or seducing them, or having a musical jam session to them, whatever type of contest or confrontation the rules focus on, or allow you to take. This means that as the game master, you need to have an idea of what stats you need to manage those contests. And this book is all about providing you about examples for those. And if challenges that aren't people are a particular part of the game, or one that's just as important as dealing with NPCs, then you need to provide examples for those as well. This could be traps in a dungeon, or environmental threats when traversing the wilderness, or the difficulties involved in building your settlement. If you can't fit all of those in your core rulebook or dedicated GM book, then you need to include that in or as your NPC antagonist book. And finally, we come to the thing that makes a lot of this much easier. Number 5, an open content license. One of the things that gets thrown around a lot, and has been thrown around since the days of original Dungeons & Dragons, is that, quote, adventures don't sell, or campaign books don't sell, or monster books don't sell, because they're all targeted for game masters. Except people do like buying them, and reading them, and hopefully playing them or incorporating them into their game. Having some kind of open content license help you offload some of that to other people. The rest from there comes together with putting a fan culture around your game that encourages the creation of more materials that you want, but can't financially justify the effort into making yourself. As seen, for example, with the zine cultures around Shadow Dark, or the OSR in general, Morkborg, as much as elements of this particular culture frustrate me, Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark. That said, for doing all this, number 1 on this list is all dependent on you. And that's something that you have, and if you need to do that for the rest of this to come along well. And in particular, branch out from expand your niche crowd. As far as the next game I'm running, well, we're going to discuss that in our next session, and I'll probably have some notes on that on the blog, but I will do a follow-up video discussing what the next game will be, and what form that campaign will probably take.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.